The bells tolled this morning for the death of Pope Francis, radical reformer, pastor to the poor. Where next for the world's oldest and largest institution?
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
Pope Francis has died after a long illness. He was able to proclaim the key doctrine of his faith, the resurrection of Christ, one final time in the Easter sunshine here yesterday. The first non-European to take the office for nearly a millennium. He was a pope who waded into politics, spoke of climate change and the horrors of war, and eschewed the trappings of office. But he leaves behind him a contested legacy of reforms and changes to the Catholic Church. After his papacy, the Church is a little more liberal to homosexuals and the divorced, a little more accepting of women in leadership roles, and a little less dominated by Europeans. When the cardinals gather here in conclave to choose a successor, they will need to choose between those who thought his changes went too far and those who thought he didn't go far enough. Some crowds have already gathered here in St. Peter's Square to pay their respects over the next week. In our first report tonight, here's Kamian Zeram.
Just yesterday, on Easter Sunday, a few hours before Pope Francis would, in the words of the Vatican, return to the home of the Father, he gave his last ever public address.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
Brothers and sisters, happy Easter, he said. A final ride round St. Peter's Square in the Pope-mobile, even a thumbs up, despite struggling with his own illness for several months.
Hello. So good to see you.
A last visit from the US Vice President J.D. Vance, but then, early this morning, Cardinal Kevin Farrell shared with the world's 1.4 billion Catholics the Pope had now passed away.
Con profondo dolore.
It is with profound sadness I must announce the death of our Holy Father, Francis.
Faithful arrived at the Vatican today to remember the first pontiff from Latin America, whose nuanced legacy will define him as more than just a reformer. Tributes arrived from leaders the world over. The King, who met him just 11 days ago in Rome, saying he and Queen Camilla have heavy hearts. Through his work and care for both people and planet, the King said, he profoundly touched the lives of so many. The Church itself mourns from within. For the Bishop of Buenos Aires, the Pope's hometown, he was, first and foremost, a man of the people.
The Pope of the poor has left us, the Pope of the marginalised, those whom nobody wanted, or in any case, those whom many exclude.
While Catholics in Syria pondered the significance of the Pope passing on Easter weekend.
As we celebrate the resurrection, he beat us to the doors of resurrection.
So, what next? The Oscar-winning film Conclave dramatized the ancient process that selects a new pope. 120 special elector cardinals are sequestered in the Sistine Chapel, where they debate and vote till 2/3 agree on the next pontiff. The secret ballots are burned. The crowds in St. Peter's Square wait and watch. Black smoke, no news. White, they've chosen. What will new leadership mean for a church that under Francis appeared to shed pomp in favour of piety? A pope who travelled the Med to champion the welfare of migrants. Who phoned the Catholic Church in Gaza every single night since the war began, recently calling for a ceasefire, and softened Catholicism's stance on sexuality as well as the role of women. The search for a successor to Pope Francis, who Catholics believe will be the 267th earthly representative of Jesus Christ, begins within weeks.
Now, Pope Francis was the first Latin American pope born in Buenos Aires into an Italian immigrant family, a reformer determined to open up the church and reach out to marginalised communities. Pope Francis took his progressive message to countries across the world, declaring that the church should be a haven for everyone. Harry Fawcett looks back at his life.
It was March 2013 that Jorge Bergoglio, Archbishop of Buenos Aires, became the 266th Pope of the Roman Catholic Church.
Let's go straight to the square now. There's a huge roar going up, and I suspect that means that the French cardinal who will announce who this Pope is on the dais.
Habemus Papam.
But even among so many predecessors, over so many hundreds of years, his was a papacy that was destined to stand out. The first pope from outside Europe in more than a millennium, the first ever from South America.
Buonasera.
And the first since 1415 to take over from a still living predecessor after the resignation of Pope Benedict. A transition portrayed on film between a conservative, austere pope criticised for his handling of clerical child abuse scandals and a man fit to give the church a more modern, more personable face.
You're the right person. Church needs to change, and you could be that change.
It could never be me.
But Pope Francis it would be, a name chosen to communicate humility, connection to the poor. His early papal visits recalled the rapturous receptions for John Paul II, Pope Francis displaying similar public warmth and even star power. Born in Argentina in 1936, of Italian heritage, Jorge Bergoglio suffered pleurisy as a young man and had part of a lung removed, a sign of respiratory problems to come. He found his vocation aged 22 and rose through the ranks of the church during the disappearances of the so-called Dirty War of the 1970s. He always denied accusations he submitted to the military dictatorship of Jorge Videla, telling a biographer he intervened with him secretly to save lives. At the height of international concern about HIV/AIDS, he kissed and washed the feet of sufferers, trying to end the stigma. And he favoured simple digs and public transport over official cars and residences. For all the shift in tone that brought his papacy, he was no arch-liberal. He followed traditional doctrine on the ordination of women and on gay marriage. He led a landmark Vatican conference on child sex abuse, kissing the hand of a survivor, but drawing criticism from many others who accused him merely of repeating general promises.
I make a heartfelt appeal for an all-out battle against the abuse of minors, both sexually and in other areas, on the part of all authorities and individuals, for we are dealing with abominable crimes that must be erased from the face of the earth.
He wasn't afraid to take on other political issues, advocating on behalf of refugees, urging negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. He advocated too for greater tolerance of LGBT members of the church, saying priests should be allowed in some circumstances to bless same-sex unions.
Condemning a person like that is a sin. Criminalising people of homosexual tendencies is an injustice.
But last year the Vatican had to apologise after the Pope was quoted as telling bishops, using an anti-gay slur, that there was already too much homosexuality in Catholic seminaries. Since early 2023, the severity of Pope Francis's health problems had been becoming ever clearer. His last years marked by repeated bouts of breathing difficulties, flu, bronchitis, intestinal surgery, as well as deteriorating mobility. But they were also marked by what many saw as the culmination of his papacy. A 3-year project soliciting opinion from throughout the Catholic communion as he strove for reform in the face of conservative opposition. It was an approach that reflected two prominent aspects of his personality, humility and ambition juxtaposed. And through it all, a veil of steeliness, on display again in the last days of his life, a determination to mark Easter Sunday to the fullest of his capabilities, perhaps even beyond them.
Well, a short time ago, Krishnan Gurumurthy spoke to Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, and began by asking about Francis's strengths and why he was so effective as Pope.
Well, I think the measure of sadness and messages that are emerging today indicates that indeed he had a reach and a capacity to touch people that was very immense. So I think his gifts were in meeting people and engaging with them and giving the sense that at this moment you were the most important thing in my heart and in my thoughts. That then translated into a remarkable ability to capture things in a gesture. So I remember well his greeting of a man with a terribly deformed face in St. Peter's Square in front of all the cameras.
I mean, he seemed to come down on sides, didn't he? I mean, you know, he was critical of President Trump's immigration plans of putting up walls. He spoke often about Gaza and he prioritised Gaza in his mind. I mean, is that the kind of leadership in a very noisy and divided world that the Catholic Church needs?
I think in most of those statements, not all, some were very absolute, but in most of those, they didn't lack subtlety either. It was partly the way they're interpreted, but he met Vance. While he knew how to get a headline, he also knew when it was necessary what diplomacy demanded.
He has managed to shape the conclave very effectively by appointing a huge number of cardinals who will be voting. Does that make his legacy more permanent, do you think?
I've never been to a conclave, so I don't understand as yet the internal dynamics. And I read the book, but I haven't seen the film, so I'm really looking forward to this.
And do you go as an individual, or do you go as a representative?
Oh, I think I go as an individual cardinal. And being a cardinal is to be an advisor to the Pope. And in the Pope's role, not so much as the Bishop of Rome, but as the universal head of the Church. So I think my perspective would have to be the broad one, rather than representing England and Wales and maybe wondering which football team they support.
Would you like the Church to continue in the direction that Francis had taken it?
I wouldn't want to suggest that the direction in which he's taken it is some radical departure from a central core of conviction and faith. I mean, many of his stances on things were, in one sense, quite traditional. They fitted in the voice of the Church because he was a man of the Church.
Given the Pope had said very compassionate things about, you know, the LGBT community, migrants, all that, could the next Pope roll all of that back?
I suppose he could. I wouldn't expect that. Because what, you know, the reality of the Church, I hope and pray, is one that has a steady heartbeat. And it's not the same as the political observation and analysis into progressive or conservative. That's a step away, and that's an interpretive tool that's used, and not always helpfully.
Just finally, somebody said this was as perfect a death for a Pope as it could be on Easter Monday.
It's a wonderful day on which to be called home, because it's precisely the day on which Jesus appeared to his disciples and encouraged them, told them to keep going, and he's come and taken him home.
Cardinal Vincent, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, with me now is Gerard O'Connell, a journalist specialising in the Vatican and author of The Election of Pope Francis, an inside story of the conclave that changed history. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You knew Pope Francis well, so a very sad personal day for you today.
Absolutely. When I knew him for more than 20 years, but yesterday I saw him close up, and I had the feeling that he was going to the house of the Father, as the Vatican said.
Because that is the extraordinary thing. He was here yesterday with his Easter blessing, which is why, despite the fact he'd been unwell, I think the death has taken so many people. So it has been so shocking.
Well, it was obvious. If you saw him close up yesterday, you realized that he wasn't himself. I waved at him, for example, and normally he would wave back. And yesterday he didn't make any reaction. And then I think he died as he wanted to die. He wanted to die quickly, he wanted to die as Pope, and he wanted to die among the people. And yesterday he came here onto the balcony where he was presented to the world 13 years ago, well, 12 years ago, and he gave his last blessing to the people. And then he drove in the Jeep around the square, and that was something extraordinary that nobody had expected.
Because the people were so important to this Pope, weren't they? He set his intentions very early by calling himself Francis, after Francis of Assisi, devoted to the poor, to the disenfranchised. That presumably is what he would like his legacy to be.
Yes, he wanted his legacy to be as one of the people. He never saw himself above anybody. Even the poorest, the sickest, the most miserable person in the world from the world standards, he would be at that level. And he really, my experience of him over the years, he always cared about you, about the person. He wanted to know what was happening in your life. And he was so deeply disturbed by what he was seeing in Gaza, what he was seeing in Ukraine, what he's seeing in...
He spoke about that constantly, didn't he?
Yes, and in his last speech yesterday, which he didn't read, but he had approved, he had kind of worked on that speech, he touched on all the issues that have been central to his pontificate.
I mean, that issue of being inclusive, of opening up the church, was one of the reasons why Conservatives took such issue with him.
Well, people like to think of themselves as better than others, as purer than others, as more Christian than others. Francis never saw the world like that. He felt he looked at you, he said, you have problems, so do I. You're a sinner, so am I.
But he understood the tension, didn't he, between trying to be an open church, but maintaining the fact that this is a church that measures change in centuries, not months or years.
Yes, but he was a very political pope. When he was in exile, before he was made bishop in Argentina, he was in exile for about almost 2 years. He read the history of the popes. And so when he was elected here, he knew exactly what the history of the popes was. And as pope, he understood his central role was to keep unity in the church, to keep the church together.
Which makes reform, which makes change very difficult, doesn't it? And he was a disappointment to some, wasn't he?
No, well, it doesn't make change difference. It means that you recognize the riches that are in the different groupings. They're not all the same. They come with different talents. And that was what his message was. You know, we have many riches. Let's not exclude. Let's include all of those riches. And they may be contrasting positions, but they still are what we are as a church.
Gerald O'Connell, thank you very much for joining us
Thank
today.
you very much.
Thank you. Well, mourners began gathering at Westminster Cathedral in central London as soon as the news emerged this morning, and there was a special mass for him there tonight. Francis Reid is there.
Yes, well, hundreds of people have gathered here this evening. They've been inside the cathedral lighting candles because, of course, there are millions of Catholics living right across the UK. So many large communities here in London, Liverpool, Glasgow, right across Northern Ireland as well. So these special requiem masses that have been held for Pope Francis right across the country. Westminster Cathedral here remains open until midnight tonight for people to come here for reflection, for prayer. And we've been speaking to different members of the Catholic community here about what Pope Francis meant to them.
It is a shock, really. You know, it's sad news for the Catholic people, you know, in the church. He was well loved all over, you know, Latin America. Especially, you know, he was very kind, and he was always with the people, you know. He was different from other popes that, you know, they keep the distance. So he was more friendly, more amicable.
Well, I got the shock this morning, and I think I'm feeling a little bereft, but at the same time I'm happy for the Pope. His suffering is over, welcome home, good and faithful servant. Yes, he's home.
What was your...
I actually met him 3 or 4 times. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, an inspiration. He was relational. He was all about living the gospel. He didn't just preach words. He absolutely lived it. He loved the poor, and he's given his life to the poor, really.
I think what just drives to mind is leniency and humility. A lot of people that couldn't really come back to the Catholic Church before, through this Pope's guidance, they've been able to rekindle their Catholic faith.
I had the privilege to see him when he went to the Philippines, and that just had a big impact in my life, in my belief.
Well, we've also heard from other different prominent voices right across the UK, and including from Northern Ireland. The leader of Sinn Féin, Mary Lou MacDonald, reflected that his was a vital voice for peace in the world. She said Pope Francis led with compassion. But we've also heard from the leader of the DUP as well, Gavin Robinson. He paid tribute, saying Pope Francis was held in deep affection, and said it was important to recognise the profound respect and admiration for Pope Francis, even for those with different theological views. And that's been really key here this evening as well, because we've seen members from the Muslim community represented here as well, really acknowledging how Pope Francis reached across to different religions and reached out to them as well, with the Diocese of Liverpool saying he was a man of the people, for the people. That really sums up, I think, what the Catholic community across the UK are feeling this evening.
Joining me now is Andrea Gagliarducci. He's a Vatican analyst with the Global Catholic Network, EWTN. I mean, a momentous day for the world's 1.4 billion Catholics. What happens next?
Well, now we're going to have the transfer of Pope Francis to the chapel, which is happening now, in this moment. And in this moment, there will be the declaration of the vacant see, the sede vacante. So it starts the moment when the church has no Pope. For one day, the Pope will be exposed in Santa Marta, where he lived, for the people that lives in the Vatican and for cardinals. Then on Wednesday will be transferred to St. Peter's Basilica, where for 3 days he will be exposed for faithful. Any faithful who want to mourn the Pope will see him and pray for him. Then there will be funerals, likely on Saturday. And then after the funerals, the cardinals will meet and will decide, will set a date for the conclave.
And of course, the question everybody is asking is who might be next. Now, how much does the man who's come before, does Pope Francis, does his legacy dictate where this might go?
Well, that's interesting, because we're going to see it when the cardinals are going to meet. We have a specific situation, that is that we have 135 cardinals eligible to vote, but none of them know each other very well. They never met. So they're going to meet each other in these congregations that are the pre-conclave meetings, and they will see for 5-6 days, they will discuss general issues. In that moment, we will see where the cardinals are going, or we can try to have an intuition about that, but we cannot be sure. So that's very interesting.
We know that Pope Francis was in some ways a divisive pope between conservatives and those who wanted a more progressive agenda. Where is your best assessment of which direction the church may go in now?
Well, I think they will look for a normalizer now. So somebody that will not quit with the reforms of Pope Francis, but will tend to normalize everything to a different pace. I mean, you know, we need time to set the canon law, to set the theology, to understand what happens, and also time to set up the governance of the church again. So they will look for somebody that will normalize, not as much as Pope Francis was, so outgoing and very present in the media.
So you think it will be in personality and, in a sense, political, theological terms, a very different character?
Will be moderate, more moderate than Pope Francis, and less larger than life than he was, I would say.
When you talk about it will be someone more moderate, of course, Pope Francis, you know, was criticised by conservatives for being too radical, and yet many wanted much more reform, didn't they?
Yeah, true. Many wanted much more reforms, but it was fun because he was also criticised for being too much conservative when he spoke about, for example, abortion issues or so on. So it was divisive because he went very radically to one place, switching from one place to another very quickly and very strongly.
He confused people sometimes, didn't he?
Sometimes he did, and that's why they're looking for somebody that is not going to confuse people, but is going to, you know, set things in a good way that can keep up somehow. That's my understanding. But happen in a conclave because, these people are old people secluded in a place. So, somebody gets 40 votes before lunch, then they go for lunch and somebody does a bad joke and he loses 40 votes in one minute. It happens all the time. Because it's kind of easy, because these people never met each other, because these people are secluded, because these people feel the pressure of the outside world looking for the Pope, and the pressure of the secret, and the pressure of the fact that they have to choose somebody that is actually a father for 1.4 billion people.
Pope Francis, when he was appointed, it was a massive departure. I think the first non-European Pope for 13 centuries. Does where the next Pope come from matter?
Well, I don't think it mattered for Pope Francis as well, because the real questions that we in a conclave are who's gonna rule me for the next few years and how much do I want it. So it's about that. Mostly Pope Francis was elected because he gave this huge speech about going outside, and perhaps this will be the issue here. It will be a speech that will make the Pope.
Andrea Gallarducci, thank you very much for coming to see us today. Thank you so much.